moment, we're going to talk with Chris Edwards of the Cato Institute and downsizinggovernment.org about what we can really do, what we really should do to address the financial woes and other issues of the United States Postal Service. But first, it's time for our first photo of the week, brought to you by Joshua Scharf Photography. Imagine this on the wall of your newly opened or newly reopened doctor's office, co-working space, or conference room. Let's put it up on the screen. This is a beautiful photograph of the rotunda at the University of Virginia. And my goodness, is that gorgeous. That's just one example of many from Joshua Scharf Photography. Whether you're looking for something bold for an investment firm, soothing for a doctor's office, or thematic for a co-working space, Joshua Scharf Photography has the artwork you'll love. You might be decorating your own space or an interior designer working on someone else's project. Either way, give Joshua Scharf Photography a call at 303-520-7503 or log on to photo.jscharf.com today. From idea to proof and digital to the fine print, Joshua will produce the perfect art to fulfill your creative vision for your client. Check him out, photo.jscharf.com today. Once again, you're joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, and we really do appreciate it coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. And we like to dive into important issues of the day to really cut through the fog. In the last segment, I broke down what's really going on with the United States Postal Service. Its delays, its efficiency issues, its budget shortfalls, all have been plaguing the Postal Service for literally decades. What are we to make of it all? What should we do in order to address these particular concerns? Could privatization and demonopolization be the answer? Chris Edwards is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and is the editor of downsizinggovernment.org. And he joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Chris, welcome to the show. It's good to have you, sir.
Hey, thank you, Jimmy.
Such a pleasure to have you on as we break down this important topic. I mean, right now, as we speak, Louis DeJoy, Postmaster General, is testifying before the House of Representatives, by the way, 2 days after they passed legislation to bail out the Postal Service for $25 billion under the guise of they need the money for the election. In the last segment, I broke down how we've seen nothing but deficits since 2006 and some of the other issues. What's your top-line view of what's happening with the Postal Service, Chris?
Well, I mean, DeJoy, the new Postmaster General, just came on the job a couple months ago back in May. He's been in the logistics industry for 4 decades, so he obviously knows in great detail how the USPS works and doesn't work, where the inefficiencies are. So when he took this new position, he was gung-ho to start cutting costs and reorganizing how the post office does its delivery between its sorting facilities and offices and that sort of stuff. So I can totally understand why DeJoy was ran out of the starting gates there to try to cut costs at USPS. I must say, though, it probably was a mistake leading up to this very politically divided election. And but I hope after the election he continues on with his cost cutting, because it desperately needs to happen at the post office.
Yeah, this is a matter more than anything, Chris Edwards, of the timing of some of these decisions, because historically this is a trend. I was sharing a Washington Post article from 2015, which talked about the closure of mail sorting machines beginning in 2012. And in 2015, it talked about numerous delays that had been plaguing the Postal Service for the first part of that year, without the coronavirus pandemic, but with other issues.
That's right. And, the postal system's been losing money now for over a dozen years. So that's the fundamental problem here. And the key reason why is because first-class mail, which is the most profitable product of the postal system, the volume of it has declined in half over the last 2 decades. So their most profitable product is disappearing as everyone has gone online. And, of course, it's not just email, but it's everything like Evite, electronic invites, it's bill paying going online. All that stuff has gone online, and it's completely undercut the original model of the Postal Service. So we need big changes. And here's the thing, every other postal system in the world is facing these same pressures. And in Europe, as I've written about, facing the same pressures, the decision they've made is to say, hey, look, this isn't a monopoly anymore. Why don't we just open this to competition and privatize it? So in Europe now, all postal systems must be open to competition. And there's about half a dozen countries like Britain that have privatized their system and said, hey, look, why don't we privatize the postal system and let it compete fairly with private sector companies? That's the obvious way ahead, it seems to me, for the United States as well.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about privatization, or a lot more, in just a moment with you, Chris Edwards. But I want to play cut 4. This is Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, presenting an argument for trying to, I think, explain away some of the Postal Service issues, but are identifying it and saying, no, the Postal Service is not a business. It's a postal service.
They lose money. This is not a business. It is called the Postal Service. And of all the services, it pays for almost all of its costs. And by the way, the law requires the Postal Service to pay 75 years of health care benefits in 10 years. What business can compete having to do that?
All right, a few different points there, Chris Edwards. Number one is the nature of the post office. What is it? Because it's semi-autonomous, sort of a quasi-governmental agency, and yet it's required to have government scrutiny. It's before Congress with the Postmaster General testifying before the United States Senate on Friday, today before the U.S. House of Representatives. You've got certain regulatory powers. They can use eminent domain, so they're empowered with a lot of things, but at the same time, they make their money by selling postal services. So one question is about the nature of the Postal Service. The other is about this health benefit provision that was put into law by Congress in 2006 that Democrats are also blaming for the post office's financial woes. If you can break that down as well.
Well, the first thing is this canard that you hear from the left often that, some service is so important, we can't leave it to the private sector. But of course, that's completely ridiculous, because we rely for our food, our clothing, our cable TV service, our internet, everything for the private sector. So the fact that it's a crucial service, there's really no argument. And the issue is, is it a natural monopoly? And the answer is no, it is not a natural monopoly. And as FedEx and UPS have been allowed to expand into what was previously USPS territory, we've seen how good the private sector is at delivering stuff. So why don't we open it all up and let the private sector compete over everything, letters, packages, the whole bit. Right now, you have this unfair situation where the postal system, it doesn't pay any taxes, any kind of taxes, property taxes or income taxes. It has very favorable regulations. It doesn't even pay parking tickets, and it's competing against USPS and FedEx for packages. That's completely unfair, and that's why the situation now is untenable. It's not a natural monopoly. Let's open up mail. Right now, the Postal Service has a legal monopoly over your mailbox and first-class mail. And I'm saying we should abolish those monopolies like other countries have done. Let's open it up. Let's let American entrepreneurs get into this business. I mean, one way to think about this is America is a land of awesome entrepreneurship. We see that over and over. Entrepreneurs build these awesome companies. Well, why are we excluding entrepreneurs from this industry? That doesn't make any sense. Entrepreneurs could add a lot to this industry, so let's open it up and let them have a crack at it. Your second point about the healthcare costs, this has sort of become a political issue. Back in 2006, the last big law change for the postal system was making money, and it seemed logical for both parties at the time that they should pre-fund they have this huge amount of healthcare costs that are unfunded. It made sense for them to start prepaying those future costs. But then it started losing money, and that prepayment requirement, we may need to adjust that now. Yeah. But that's only part of the problem. The main problem is that mail volume has plunged, and we need to restructure the postal system for that reason. It's in a death spiral, just because of the nature of the internet and the change in the economy.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, too, that in terms of health benefits, these unfunded liabilities they're especially talking about are health benefits for retirees, which if you're in the private sector, if you happen to offer that, and it's not offered very often anymore, then you're going to have to make sure that you provide adequate funding. This isn't, a lot of times Democrats say,
exactly.
oh, companies don't have to do this. Well, if they are offering retiree health benefits, they need to offer that kind of thing or they need to take this type of step because otherwise it's going to be problematic for them when the bill comes due.
That's exactly right. So private sector companies have to pre-fund their retirement pension benefits. It's legally required, as well as it makes good business sense. But here's the thing, that the USPS provides post-employment health benefits. In other words, if you retire at the postal system at 52 years old or 55 years old, you get government health benefits for another decade before Medicare kicks in. Well, virtually no business in the private sector does that. I mean, if I retire from the Cato Institute, or anyone retires from a private sector company, we don't get 10 years of health benefits after we've already retired and before Medicare kicks in. So that's the real problem here, that the benefits provided by the postal system are way too expansive and too expensive.
We're talking with Chris Edwards, Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute and editor of downsizinggovernment.org. I want to put up something interesting. So I write for a local publication here in Colorado where I broadcast from called Colorado Politics. And I have a new piece up today. My newest column for the week is up specifically talking about privatizing the Postal Service and what Colorado's current governor and former Congressman Jared Polis wrote for the Independence Institute in 2001. Let's put this up on the screen. A paper entitled Privatizing and Eliminating the Monopoly of the United States Postal Service by Jared Polis. He was then a member of the Colorado State Board of Education, August 15th, 2001. And let's put up the next pick. You're going to like this one, Chris Edwards. Pick 8. This is 2016, 15 years later when he was in Congress, privatizing the U.S. Postal Service, linking to the article, that version written by you, Chris Edwards, at downsizinggovernment.org and at the Cato Institute's website, cato.org, which is pretty stunning to me. But I actually came upon his 2001 paper, when I was a student at Regis University in 2011, writing my own paper on privatizing the U.S. Postal Service. And I just want to read one quick passage from Polis's paper. Again, he's a liberal Democratic governor of Colorado right now. And he was in Congress in 2016 and has been on board clearly with privatizing the Postal Service for years. He says, and I quote, USPS is hamstrung by a pseudo-governmental status that stifles innovation and excellence in both itself and the competition. Through inertia and intransigence, USPS remains owned by the United States government, which also grants it a monopoly in key categories, including home mailbox delivery. He argues that we should, quote, end all monopolistic protections and special treatment enjoyed by USPS and transfer the capital stock of USPS into private hands more capable of exercising meaningful diligence and improving operating efficiency, thus allowing the profits and stock appreciation to accrue to the benefit of the employees and other shareholders. Chris Edwards of the Cato Institute and downsizinggovernment.org. That's not Donald Trump writing that. That's not Louis DeJoy writing that. That's a liberal Democratic governor, a former colleague of Nancy Pelosi, who's claiming it's Republicans and Trump who want to privatize it. You and I would like to see the Postal Service privatized. Clearly, Jared Polis would, but Donald Trump doesn't. Republicans aren't even talking about that. But what's your reaction?
So it's interesting you raised that. I've read that essay and I thought it was very good. And I like you, I was surprised to find it. I actually went in when Polis was a member of Congress from Colorado. I went into his office and talked to him about that because he had seen my writings on it. And, you know, post office reform was an issue in front of Congress a couple of years ago. And so we had a very good chit chat about it. I mean, he basically said what a number of members of Congress I've talked to have said, that, look, Chris, I think you're right about privatization and demonopolization, but the country that other members of Congress aren't really ready for this yet. And you often hear this, that hey, it's this major reform you're talking about is a good idea, but all my colleagues aren't really ready for that, and that's it's an unfortunate way to think. Polis, I must say, I mean, he has some libertarian tendencies, which I give him credit for. He's certainly not. Every 2 years, I score the governors in our Cato's fiscal report card, which will be coming out in October. And I must say, looking at his record as governor of Colorado, he's kind of in the middle. He's not, I could name a bunch of governors who are far more left wing than him for sure. So, I'd encourage Mr. Polis to Governor Polis to continue advocating for reforming the postal system. And he's shown a willingness to sort of buck his party on some policy issues. So I'd suggest he continue speaking out on this issue.
Well, I would like him to say, you know what? Hey, this actually would be a good idea to do these serious reforms. It is in disarray. This is something that's been going on for decades. It's nothing new. It's not don't just play politics with the Postal Service. Now, he's not. Instead, he's getting out there and talking about vote by mail and how we should spread it nationally because it's worked well in Colorado. But he's not talking about the poll. But then again, he's not a federal official anymore. But even then, it's still a relevant point of conversation, especially today with what's happening in this Postal Service debate. But let's get back to the post office, because these are some points that Polis raised in his 2001 paper that you have raised, that I have raised. And that is this monopoly of the Postal Service. They have a monopoly over the mail, over first-class mail in a variety of different areas. There are some areas where they don't, and that's where we've seen greater innovation. We've actually seen the best performance of the post office when it's involved in shipping packages as opposed to just doing the first-class mail thing. Shipping packages where it's competitive against FedEx and UPS has worked out the best for the Postal Service financially, it seems. But not only do they have a monopoly in certain areas, but they have significant powers of government and exemptions in a variety of areas. And I'd like for you to talk about that, the inherent advantages that the Postal Service has.
Well, the first point I would make is that the federal government's general policy is to encourage competition in all industries. I mean, that's why we have antitrust laws, and we have had it for over a century. I think there's problems with antitrust laws, but that's a separate discussion. The general policy of the U.S. government is to encourage competition in industry. There's no reason why, and everyone right now, for example, is worried about competition in the high-tech industry. Well, there's no reason why the government ought to have a forcible legal monopoly on this one industry. It doesn't make any sense, especially with all the technological changes we've got going on these days. So here's the basic problem that, while the Postal Service has expanded in the package delivery, and that's fine, it's a way for the postal system to make money. One of the problems is, as you touched on, the postal system doesn't pay any taxes, federal, state, or local, property, income, sales taxes, or any tax of any kind. It has all kinds of regulatory advantages. It has the power of eminent domain. It doesn't even pay, postal trucks don't even pay parking tickets in cities or anything like that. So the postal system has this huge and unfair competitive advantage against FedEx and UPS. So that can't go on. So this issue of the postal system, we can't just keep subsidizing it and allow the current situation to go on, because it creates this unfair competition. And here's something that people may not know. I mean, everyone takes for granted that FedEx is, everyone realizes it's an awesome company. It's one of the best run companies in America. And if you want a letter to get somewhere urgently, fast, and much more reliable than the postal system, you'll put it in FedEx. But FedEx is only allowed to do that because of a 1979 deregulation that happened. Before that deregulation, it was illegal for FedEx or anyone else to deliver an overnight urgent letter. So today's marketplace in packages and letters has already been shaped by this deregulation that happened in 1979. And I think the next logical step, again, like they've done in Europe, is just to deregulate the whole damn thing and let entrepreneurs come in and compete and let customers decide what company they want to go with.
Sure. Well, and Chris Edwards, one thing that you hear often as a criticism or a claim that no, you couldn't privatize is, well, there are a lot of rural areas, and the private companies aren't going to make a point of servicing those rural areas adequately. And in fact, in some cases, the private companies will use the Postal Service for their last mile or to help them get to a particular rural areas. And therefore, we need to keep the Postal Service robust. We cannot privatize it because the private sector won't fill the job, won't complete what's needed. What do you make of that argument?
Well, the first thing I would say is, well, we don't know because the government has a legal monopoly. We haven't let entrepreneurs give it a crack. Entrepreneurs are capable of doing amazing things in the American economy if we just let them. Secondly, it's actually open to debate whether people worry, and I hear this all the time in response to my columns, that people will say, oh, well, if you privatize the postal system, they wouldn't deliver to all the rural addresses. That isn't necessarily true. And there's been some economists who've argued actually that it doesn't actually necessarily cost more to deliver in rural areas because postal delivery folks go along and they put the mail into mailboxes at the end of people's laneways. Whereas in suburban areas, especially sort of sprawling suburban areas, they got to get out of their truck and walk around. So it isn't necessarily a higher cost to deliver in a rural area. That said, I think it doesn't make sense to deliver mandated 6 days a week anymore. Some places, everywhere in Europe's gone down to at least 5 days. New Zealand has recently gone down to 3 days for its guaranteed delivery. Why not reduce the number of days of delivery? That would make it more cost efficient for any business to deliver to every address. And so there's reasonable reforms we can make here, to reduce the 6 day every address in America mandate that we have now. That doesn't really make sense anymore in the internet era.
Just a few minutes left with our guest, Chris Edwards, Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute and editor of downsizinggovernment.org. One other thing that makes it more difficult for the Postal Service to be financially viable is the fact that, while it has certain advantages in terms of the monopoly, it is exempt from certain zoning laws. It can use eminent domain. Wants to make a new post office, it can use eminent domain to take a private company, a private establishment, private house, and go ahead and build that. A new facility if they wanted to do so. Just as an example, you were talking about it being exempt from taxes, state, local, and federal, and so forth. But there are also disadvantages that they're faced with. For example, in terms of setting prices, if they want to up the price for first-class mail or make certain changes to their pricing or negotiate certain contracts, they have to go through a multi-layer bureaucratic process and may even need to get congressional authorization. Talk to us a little bit about that, those kinds of things that hamstring the Postal Service.
Well, the great disadvantage to the postal system being part of the government is that Congress micromanages everything they do. And to put one statistic on this, there are 4,500 rural post offices in the United States that only get an average of 4 customers a day. So the USPS is keeping these thousands of locations open for just 4 customers. That makes no economic sense. It makes no environmental sense. And actually, that's a whole nother topic, that a lot of, having this as an inefficient government monopoly doesn't make sense for the environment either. The USPS has over 200,000 gas guzzling trucks that are inefficient. We need to pare that down, which would be good economically and good for the environment. So here's the thing. We want USPS to compete fairly with FedEx and UPS on package delivery. The way to do that is if you privatize it, the USPS can then expand into, like any business, they can expand into new areas, maybe grocery delivery that they find profitable. Right now, the USPS gets micromanaged by Congress. They're not allowed to cut a lot of their costs, and they're not allowed to expand into any growing areas like any other business. So we tie the USPS's hands. We won't allow it to make money. And so, it seems members of Congress kind of want to hamstring it so that it's going to require a giant bailout down the road from taxpayers. It makes no sense, the current situation.
Oh, no doubt about it. And I think more people, if they can get exposed to this argument that you and I are talking about, which is why I want to talk about it today, in favor of privatizing the Postal Service and how it is a bipartisan idea. Looking at Jared Polis, for example, all across the spectrum, I think people can get on board. In fact, Polis, in his paper from 2001, he quotes a then Postal Service Postal Rate Commission member saying, quote, "Why would a consumer advocate and liberal Democrat push to privatize the Postal Service with 900,000 government employees? Simple. Because it would be the best way to save the institution from oblivion and put government resources to their most efficient and socially responsible use." That was Ruth Goldway, who was on the Postal Rate Commission back in 2001 when Polis published his paper. So it is something that you can cross barriers with if you actually have a genuine discussion.
I would say one of the things I often will come up against is I'll see this on my Twitter, that post office carriers will get really upset with my arguments and the like. I would argue to the 600,000 unionized postal workers that if you want your job to survive and if you want to thrive and get higher salary and benefits down the road, you should want privatization, because the current Postal Service is being driven into a ditch by the politicians. You want to work for a thriving private company that is expanding. It would be better for you. So I would say that, postal workers, they ought to, sort of wake up and smell the coffee here, that I think they'd be better off in the private sector than they are in this government dinosaur entity that is being micromanaged by Congress and is in a death spiral.
I keep quoting, maybe it's because of my governor, maybe it's because he's a Democrat, but I have to do one more quote that resonates with what you're saying from this 2001 post office paper by Jared Polis, governor of Colorado. "We as a society have invested heavily in our Postal Service, and it would be a great shame to write off the hard work of the men and women who built and run the USPS. Unless we unshackle USPS and allow it to leverage its infrastructure effectively as a normal, privately owned company, the USPS will sadly fade away as it becomes increasingly irrelevant in the marketplace, destroying an infrastructure and logistical system that could otherwise be leveraged to provide great benefits and causing even more harm in its desperate regulation casting death throes." And he talks also about doing right by the Postal Service workers. I mean, it's true. If you want them to be able to feel confident, to have a reliable job, to have stronger financial prospects for the organization that they work with, privatization and demonopolization are the keys.
I think it is the future. I think it's the obvious future, despite what Nancy Pelosi's, and other opponents of privatization say. And actually, there's a lot of Republicans that are against privatization too.
Yes.
And a lot of Republicans actually prevent the USPS by closing, low volume offices in their districts and the like. So it is a bipartisan problem. I think it's the future, though. Again, the more countries, privatize abroad, the more good examples we're going to have. Britain privatized its 500-year-old Royal Mail 5 years ago. It's been a success. Germany privatized its Deutsche Post 2 decades ago, and it's a booming success. If you ask postal experts what's the best postal system in the world, they'll often point to Deutsche Post in Germany, which is private. So I think that is the future. We're falling behind. I think we need to make this big reform, not before the election, but in coming years.
Well, and that's a very important distinction. Get through 2020, and then we can talk about this in a full-throated way in 2021, and we certainly should move on it. But your point about bringing up Western European countries, I mean, also the Netherlands and New Zealand, although that's not in Europe, but Western countries, it's important because they're often identified by the left as examples of what we should do for good government and good services for the people of our country. Well, we're clearly failing. If that's the standard that they're presenting, then we're clearly failing because they've been moving on this in the way you're describing.
There's no doubt about it. I think a lot of Americans, really on both sides, often view Europe as kind of just a hopeless welfare state. In fact, Europe is a lot more free market than the United States in a number of areas. And one that I've written about a lot is airports. All U.S. airports. There's over 400 big commercial airports in the United States. They're all owned by governments. In Europe, over half of their airports now are privatized. Heathrow Airport, most famously, started this trend back in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher. Half of all airports in Europe are now privatized. So in some ways, Europe is more free market than the United States. And I wish American policymakers would sort of get out of their bunker and look at what's going on around the world and just try to take the best practices from other countries. The best practices in terms of markets and competition and efficiency. And we see a lot of good things in Europe.
Chris Edwards, just a final point for your comment, and then we'll let you go. And I so appreciate your time today. It's a very important discussion. Right now, we do see Democrats, folks on the left, trying to say, oh, well, if we just fund $25 billion of the Postal Service, then we will be able to ensure that vote by mail is going to happen effectively and well. When really, even the Postmaster General, we played the clip earlier, the Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, said in the Senate hearing on Friday that he has enough cash on hand in order to cover the election costs. So I don't think this has anything to do with the election. It's much more, let's paper over the issues. Let's try to bail out the Postal Service using the current pandemic and the current state of affairs at the Postal Service as an excuse, and vote by mail as an excuse and a justification to give them money in order to help bail them out during these difficult times for the Post Office that have basically, frankly, always been difficult.
That's right. I mean, you're right. DeJoy said he doesn't need this extra $25 billion right now, and we shouldn't give it to him. The most important thing for the election, we're all crossing our fingers that it's not, a mess, is that Americans who want to vote need to request their ballots early. Yes. States need to inform their residents and citizens. They got to request their ballots a few weeks early to make sure it gets in on time and counted on election day.
Yeah. Yep. We do need that. That's for darn sure. And we've been talking about that a great deal here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Chris Edwards, Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, editor of downsizinggovernment.org, which has a great article. Jared Polis shared it on privatization of the U.S. Postal Service. Be sure to check it out. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks for diving in.
Thanks a lot, Jimmy. Thanks for your interest in the topic.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Once again, Chris Edwards from the Cato Institute joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads and making just so many critical points. I do want to play one more clip of DeJoy. This is cut 12. If we can drop that in, please, Nathan Matoush. Oh, looks like we have it ready. So this is Louis DeJoy on Friday, Postmaster General, being asked about the shortfall and the realistic path forward for the Postal Service. I just want to give a taste because I think he's looking with foresight. Now, he can't advocate for the privatization of the Postal Service, but I suppose he could, but he probably wouldn't for a variety of reasons, of course. But he was asked specifically about it, and I think he really has an understanding of what needs to be done. Just take a listen.
We are not self-sustained. We have a $10 billion shortfall, and we'll continue to have, over the next 10 years, we'll have a $245 billion shortfall. So we need to, and our management team and our board there is a path that we are planning, okay, with the help of some legislation, with some cost impacts, with some new revenue strategies, and that will help and some pricing freedom from the PRC. We believe we have a plan to do that. But one thing that's not in the plan is not doing anything after the election. It is an ambitious plan because we have $10 billion to bridge. Now, the plan has not been finalized. We have hundreds of initiatives we look like take the Alaska bypass plan, the discussion. That's an item on the table. That's an unfunded mandate. It costs us like $500 million a year. And if I'm not saying
what you can get from that answer, you don't need to finish it because you can tell that he knows what he is talking about. He understands what needs to be done. The timing of some of these initiatives was off, but it didn't begin just because of Louis DeJoy in most of these cases. Some of the changes we've seen this year, it was already starting. The Postal Service was already bringing down some of the equipment, shutting down mail sorters, and taking some of these other steps. They had already warned states about vote by mail and some of the concerns that can come about if you're rushing to a system. You need to be aware and make sure that you are sending your ballots with enough time, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that DeJoy understands what's necessary here in order to try and give some semblance of financial viability, and the left is using him as a scapegoat to advance their vote-by-mail agenda and to get at President Trump. Keep in mind, once again, yes, DeJoy donated to President Trump, but Trump did not appoint him. It was the Postal Rate Commission that appointed the Postmaster General. That's what happens. Keep that in mind as we move forward in this debate. We should be taking a serious look at what's happening with the Postal Service, not just papering over and saying, oh, let's just throw money at the problem. That doesn't solve anything. We need to get underneath the hood. We need to look closely. We need to have a meaningful discussion and not allow politics and scapegoating from the left to diminish the value of the conversation that we could otherwise have. Let's keep everything in perspective. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.